Hi, today we're going to be talking about evolutionary psychology again, and this time we're going to be looking at natural selection and adaptation. Now, the foundation of evolutionary psychology is a thorough understanding of natural selection needed in order to produce behavioral adaptions. Now, the evolutionary psychology depends upon the Darwinian theories of evolution, as published in The Origin of Species in November 1859, and adapted since then by academics over the years until we have a modern, they call it a modern synthesis of adaptation, which includes DNA and other scientific discoveries that we've made about the inheritance of behaviors and characteristics from generation to generation. Now, natural selection is the sort of the basis of Darwinian theory, and it says that some mutations, and a mutation, of course, is a behavior or physical characteristic that occurs randomly and unexpectedly. It's not planned, it's not designed. It just occurs like a blip in the hereditary process. And some of these mutations that occur prove to be adaptive or an advantage for survival and reproduction as the environment changes over time. For example, the human environment changed from being a forest one to a grasslands one as the earth dried out and the trees started to recede. And us humans found our trees dying off and going, and we were crawling around on all fours in long grass. So when someone decided they're going to stand up and look over the top of the grass, that was probably due to a mutation. Now, the ability to actually continue to do that and without falling down, without falling over, or needing to go back to all fours frequently, was some sort of mutation that enabled those segments of the human species to predominate in an environment that was no longer suited. Now, over time, the mutation that caused the ability to stand on hind legs and walk without falling down, without falling over, became more common over time, and eventually it became the norm. It became the thing that was most common about the human species. Now, adaptions are not designed. They might look like they're designed. They're not a solution to a problem. In other words, the problem didn't occur and then someone comes up with a solution to the problem. In fact, the mutations occurred before the problem arose. So it's just a lucky chance that the change in the environment happens to suit a particular mutation that already existed in the species. For example, if with the human species, when we were living in trees, someone did have a mutation which enabled them to walk quite comfortably on their hind legs, then that person, when the trees disappeared, or that member of the species or their descendants, would have a decided advantage when it came to living in grasslands. Okay, so there's no design involved, there's no problem solving involved. In fact, the problem occurs after the solution has been found. So the solution came first and the problem came second. Now, natural selection and sexual selection, which are the two foundations or the two theories that Darwin based his book on. And with natural selection, he determined that species change over time. In other words, species aren't absolute. They don't stay the same forever. And the mechanism by which species change is called natural selection and sexual selection. So they're two different mechanisms, but the process or the result is similar. And with natural selection, there are certain prerequisites that Darwin says are required for natural selection to occur. And the first one is variety. The second one is heredity. The third one is fecundity. And the fourth one is demography. Now, having a look at the first one, which is variety, the variations must be real. In other words, the differences between individuals are structural or functional. In other words, it's the way they look or the way they behave, or certain things that they're enabled now to do certain things that they couldn't do before, which is functional. So it must be something where these members are not absolutely identical. So there's something about the ones with the mutations that and the variation that makes them different from the previous ones. For example, the lizards on the Galapagos Islands learn to swim. And as far as we know, they're the only swimming lizards in the world. And that was obviously due to a mutation which existed, and then the need or the what do you call it? The earth changed, or the geology changed, and these lizards found themselves on the islands, and only the ones that had the mutation that enabled them to swim were able to get the food that they needed in order to survive, and they became the normal type of lizard for the Galapagos Islands. And the same occurs with the finches on different islands in the Galapagos, that they are different species. They're all finches, but they're different species of finches. And the difference mainly is in mutations in their beaks that enable them to cope with different types of food. And if they got to an environment, or they found themselves in an environment where there was only a particular type of food, the finches that had the mutation that enabled them to cope with that type of food, like hard-shelled nuts or something like that, were likely to survive and reproduce more offspring and therefore proliferate. The second prerequisite is heredity. In other words, variations in the species must be hereditable. They must be passed on. Now, Darwin didn't know what the mechanism was that passed it on. We do, and we know that this mechanism is DNA, genes, and he didn't know that. However, he did observe that inheritance of structures and functions between generations does occur. The third prerequisite is fecundity. In other words, members of the species must reproduce at a rate that replaces the parents, or more than replaces the parents. So if we were to merely have 2 children, each couple has 2 children, then eventually the human species would die out, because there's no growth, there's no increase. Now, if the species produces more than the parents, then there's going to be variation, and the variation is what fuels natural selection. Okay, so moving on to the fourth point. The fourth prerequisite, which is demography. And this means that some individuals in the population survive and reproduce more than others. And this is purely random, purely accidental. There's no design in it. It's just, it happens that some individuals do better at the reproduction process than others. And where they occur, they might occur in different groups. So it's like a demographic, what do you call it, just distribution of individuals. Now, the outcome of all these prerequisites is that hereditable characteristics become more common over time. In other words, if you get a mutation and the mutation is adaptive, in other words, it enables the members of the species or particular members to survive better and to reproduce more, then their characteristics will become more common over time. And this is what is called natural selection. Now, sexual selection is where either the male or the female gets to choose who their partner is going to be. And in most species, believe it or not, it's the female who's the choosy one, the female who gets to choose the male. And a good example of that is the peacock. And the peacock, the male peacocks, are not suited for survival at all, really, because the females prefer peacocks with very big, cumbersome tails, tail feathers, and they put on a great show. And they see these tail feathers as being a sign of good genes or good heritable characteristics. So they prefer to mate with the peacocks with the largest tails and the more colourful tails. And these are the ones that get, these are the characteristics that get passed down through the males of the line from then on. So it's all down to choosing who chooses what type of mate, and how often is a particular type of mate preferred over others. Now, adaptive behaviours are not designed, absolutely not. So the characteristics that evolve are the result of natural or sexual selection, and they're called evolutionary adaptions. And we'll be talking a lot more about evolutionary adaptions as we go. In fact, it'll become quite a catchphrase. Everything is either an evolutionary adaptation or not an evolutionary adaptation. They're not solutions to a problem, as I said, and they don't have a purpose. In other words, they weren't designed for a purpose. They weren't designed to solve a particular problem. They just happen accidentally, and then something comes along that makes them purposeful or the solution to a problem. In other words, the solution occurs before the problem occurs. And of course, the individuals in that particular environment who have these adaptions, these characteristics, are more likely to survive and reproduce, and therefore their genes get passed on to the next generation more frequently than others' genes. Now, our adaptive agency detector, which we looked at a bit last time, is a part of our survival kit. We need to have a good agency detector in order to work out whether what we're looking at is dangerous or not. In other words, we need to be able to impugn or impute intention to other human beings and to animals and to maybe geological situations. We need to be able to say it has good intentions or bad intentions. In other words, is this going to have me for lunch, or is it going to be my best friend? So we have this agency detector for our survival. It's very important. However, it does make us tend to see intention where there isn't any. And that's how most divorces occur, where people impute bad intentions to the other person when there were no such bad intentions. However, there's no convincing the injured party that there were no bad intentions. And it's false positives that are safe. I mean, in this day and age of a pandemic, where we talk a bit about false positives and false negatives in the testing system. And we know that a false positive means that someone is said to have it but doesn't, and a false negative is someone who does have it but they say he doesn't have it. Now, in the real world, in the world of survival, it's better to believe that something has bad intentions when they haven't than it is to believe that they have good intentions when they actually have bad intentions. So that's called a false positive. So it's better to impugn bad intentions to people so that you won't be disappointed. In other words, to impugn bad intentions to someone and they have good intentions is a terrible disappointment. So we don't want to be disappointed. But I think we'd be more disappointed if we impugned good intentions to somebody and they actually had bad intentions. So false positives are preferred to false negatives. Well, what that means is that we are always impugning intentions to everything. Everything must have an intention, even though it may be an inanimate object. Now, in evolutionary psychology, the way we determine whether something is an adaptation, an evolutionary adaptation or not, is by showing that this behavior results in increased survival and reproduction. That's the gold standard. If it's likely, if this behavior in the evolutionary environment is more likely to produce, cause better survival and have the person produce more children during their lifetime and have those children survive, of course, then that's regarded as an evolutionary adaptation. Now, the thing we have to bear in mind is that happiness and well-being are irrelevant to evolutionary fitness. Our DNA, because Darwin didn't know about DNA, but we do, our DNA doesn't care about our happiness. It doesn't care whether we're happy or not. All our DNA cares about is getting copies of itself into the next generation. Now, if that's a painful process, then so be it. It won't. It is not. It is only interested in making sure that the job gets done. Whether we're happy about it or not is not relevant to our DNA. Now, what usually happens, the prime directive for human beings is to breed and to raise their children to adulthood where they can breed, in other words, so our DNA gets projected into future generations. And our DNA, of course, is very selfish. It wants itself to dominate the future generations, and to hell with anyone else's DNA. But luckily, along the way, we discovered a thing called reciprocal altruism, where people with different DNA were able to cooperate with each other and build a better world, until we decided to change it all about 12,000 years ago. So cooperating became more important than maximizing our own DNA. But that means that we still don't want to maximize it. Still, our DNA still doesn't want to be maximized. It certainly does. But whether we're happy or not in the process is irrelevant. Now, adaptions fall into different categories. Firstly, there's the adaption, of course, and that's like babies that suckle at the breast. I've never had that privilege, but people who have tell me that the baby will crawl all over the mother until it finds the nipple, and once it attaches to the nipple, it will automatically start sucking, and no one told it to do that. No one told it how to do that. That is an evolutionary adaptation, in other words. Members of the species that have this behavioral adaptation are going to survive, and those who don't, won't. Now, there are side effects of adaptions, and that's like infants who suck their thumbs. In other words, they have a sucking response, but they're sucking on a thumb for comfort, but it actually has no evolutionary benefit because it doesn't improve their survivability or their reproductive ability. And then there are sheer accidents. In other words, there are behaviors that occur that really don't have any benefit whatsoever, but they can be either positive, negative, or neutral. And these things like most people have a tendency when they clench their hands to put their left thumb on top. Although it's not always guaranteed, but most people have that tendency. And the you call it the innate tendency to do that is neither adaptive nor non-adaptive. It's completely neutral. It's just a thing. It's just an accident that occurred in the development of the human species. Now, the scientific process itself, science isn't absolute. It works on the basis that similar causes are likely to produce similar effects. So in other words, that's like predictability. If they in their process of their experiments or observations, discover if this happens and that's going to follow, then they can generalize that into other similar situations. Now, the laws that they come up with are not absolute. They become refined over time or get discarded over time. In fact, science is not the process of discovering the truth. Science is a process of becoming less wrong over time. In other words, science is always wrong. It's just becoming less wrong as they find out more. Yeah. Now, to conclude, evolutionary psychologists see behavior through a Darwinian lens. They're always looking through that Darwinian magnifying glass, if you like, or microscope, depending which way you want to look at it. And their purpose is to try to explain what the behavior that they see in modern human beings in terms of their evolutionary past. In other words, was this an evolutionary adaptation or not? Can it be traced back to an inherited behavioral tendency that was adaptive in evolutionary times? And it's a process of putting biology back into psychology. And as we've seen in the past in this course, there was a time in the early part of the 20th century when people tried to take biology out of psychology, and they did succeed for quite a while until late in the 20th century. We started to put biology back into psychology. And of course, the reason they took biology out of psychology was for political reasons. It was not convenient to think of human beings as having instincts or innate. It was much better to think of human beings as being able to be changed through political action. Now, evolutionary adaptions, as we've seen, result from behavioral mutations that later proved to be advantageous. In other words, they're not a solution to a problem, they're just something that happened, and then the environment changes, and whatever that behavioral propensity is becomes an advantage for those people. And of course, this mutation makes it more likely they'll survive and reproduce. And we call these behavioral mutations an evolutionary adaptation. In other words, it must increase survivability and it must increase the reproduction rate of that person. And of course, as we saw, adaptions are not designed. Our overactive agency detector wants to see purpose and design everywhere. It cannot cope, or we cannot cope with the thought that things happen purely by random, chaotic accident. There's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no purpose. No one in charge. There's no designer. It just all happened by accident. It's a bit hard to swallow for us, but if you can swallow it, even to a small degree, you'll find that life is much easier to live because now suddenly the inexplicable becomes explicable. You can understand why we are the way we are, why each of us internally is the way we are, why our groups and relationships function the way they do, why people in the world behave the way they do. It all becomes common sense, easy to understand. Without that, we have to invent theories, weird theories, to explain why people do what they do. Okay, so remembering that the solution came before the problem. So the solution arose, and then later on a problem arose that the solution fitted. Now we have in evolutionary psychology, what we're really doing is trying to address the mismatch between our behavioral tendencies and the environment we've created. Now, about 12,000 years ago, we moved from a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer way of life, where the largest groups of people that got together were probably no more than 100. That was as much as they could deal with. And of course, the scarcity of food from time to time meant large congregations of people living in the same place weren't possible. So we didn't have large groups of people, large populations to deal with. We only had small ones, which was a lot easier. And life, of course, was harder in the sense that we had to go hunting our food, looking for it. It wasn't easily available, and we couldn't guarantee the availability of food. However, 12,000 years ago, the climate of the Earth became milder. It went from changed from an ice age to a more temperate age, and it became possible in certain parts of the world to grow your own food. Plant the seeds and almost guarantee that there'd be enough rain and the sunshine would be there, and everything you needed to grow these plants were there. And of course, domestic animals, they domesticated animals at the same time. And so they started having some control over the food supply. Mind you, there were downsides to that. And one of the downsides was that the quality of the diet got less, it plummeted dramatically. In other words, we went from a very diverse diet to a very non-diverse diet. And by the time of the Roman Empire, which of course was only 2,500 years ago, they'd gotten down to the point where, at least in the Mediterranean world, bread was the staple diet. So people lived mainly on bread, and you can imagine what that would do to your health over a period of time, with not a lot of other nutritious foods being added. And they also found that during that time, our brains shrunk, got smaller, because of the bad nutrition. And not only that, we started to live in large congregations of people, first towns, villages, towns, and then cities, and then mega cities, and then nation states. Now we're going global at the moment, trying to go global. Now the problem with that, of course, is our behavioural tendencies were never, well, I can't say intended, but they did not evolve to live in such large groups of people. So we don't have you might say, the brain equipment to cope with living in large groups like that. We're trying our best, but no one's come up with a satisfactory solution to the problem. So the purpose of evolutionary psychology is to try and first demonstrate there is this mismatch. It does occur. And because we know that there is a mismatch, we know why we're having so much trouble finding a satisfactory way of life in this world that we've created, then we can do something about it. In other words, you cannot fix what you can't see. So if you're blind to something, you can't fix it. You'll be flummoxing around trying to try this, try that, try some other thing, but you'll never get to the bottom of it because you actually can't see what the problem really is. So once you see what the problem really is, then we're in a good place to find some solutions. And there are solutions. In fact, one of the best solutions that has popped up is about 2,500 years ago, when a guy called Siddhartha Gautama, and now also known as the Buddha, came up with this way of getting human beings out of their heads and back into the natural environment through a thing called mindfulness meditation. And that is probably the best solution we have to the mismatch between our behavioural tendencies and the world we've created. So we'll do more of that as we go, and hopefully by the time of the end of this series of lectures, you'll be ready to go out there and take on the world. Okay, have a good one. See you later.